Live from Begyle Brewing in Ravenswood, you're listening to Chicago Stories, a podcast featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans and special guests, as told to Mayor Rahm Emanuel.
Welcome to Chicago Stories. We're with Josh Noel and the author of Barrel-Aged Stout and Selling Out. Stout or out? Which one comes first?
First is barrel-aged stout, and then comes the selling out.
Oh, so let me ask you a question. How do you know what is a microbrewery? How would you define that? Is it by size, by taste?
Well, so there is an official definition by the Brewers Association, which is a craft trade group based in Boulder, Colorado, and they define a craft brewery as small, which means less than 6 million barrels of beer, which is still a lot of beer, traditional, which means basically you make beer the old-fashioned way, and independent, which is really sort of what people fight about these days, which means you're not owned by Miller Coors or Anheuser-Busch or Heineken or something like that. So they're actually you sort of jumped right into the wasp's nest there. The definition of craft beer is
I'm a middle child. I have a habit of doing that.
You know how to do that, and you did it. And that's something that people love to get all riled up about is what is craft beer, what isn't, and what should we care about, and what shouldn't we care about when it comes to beer.
Because I'm just doing this before we drink, and I really want to get to that. What is the kind of seminal event between the Big Five and the kind of craft beer industry? Why does it happen here in Chicago? Why does it happen with Goose Island? And it doesn't happen in a San Francisco, a Portland, a Denver, more the kind of Rockies West.
Well, it started...
Why do you think it's here?
Goose Island's buyout in 2011 was the first major buyout of a small, independent beer company to a major global beer company. And Chicago, it was not incidental. Chicago was actually a very attractive market for Anheuser-Busch because it's a place that they've struggled. Miller Coors is a Miller town, basically. And Anheuser-Busch has struggled in Chicago. It liked the Goose Island brand. They like the beer. But Chicago it's the intersection. It's still to this day, one of the toughest beer markets in the country. It is incredibly competitive here in Chicago. And to get a foothold in Chicago, third biggest city, a lot of disposable income in this city. We're, fairly adventurous eaters and drinkers. That made Chicago...
As long as it includes pizza,
that helps meat. If it has, some cheese and some sauce. Chicago was a very attractive market for Anheuser-Busch. So then they kept on buying after Goose Island and bought 9 more breweries all over the country. But it is not coincidental that the effort began here in Chicago.
And as you say in the book, Anheuser-Busch tried to doing something in the craft beer industry and falls flat on its face. Why is that? Just because it's big, can't do it, doesn't understand the culture?
Yeah.
How much of this is culture versus...
A lot is culture. That's a large part of when someone walks into a brewery, they're not just having a beer. They're having an experience. They're talking with the brewer. The brewer could be behind the bar. The brewer could be leading a tour. They're seeing the tanks where the beer is made. It is very much an experience and a cultural experience. And Anheuser-Busch, when it started experimenting with craft beer, it looked at craft beer the same way it looked at Bud Light, which was, hey, we're going to make a liquid and we're going to put it in a bottle, and then we're going to get people to buy it. And craft beer doesn't operate like that.
What's interesting is when you look at Miller, you look at Anheuser-Busch or Bud, etc., the taste, basically flattens out. There's no distinction. It's because it becomes homogenized. And it's
in a word, that's exactly what American beer was before the rise of craft beer.
As they're flattening out taste distinction and it's becoming more homogenized, sales are flattening out. And it's like, it didn't, I don't have an MBA, I'm not a marketing genius, or I play one on TV at least. To me that was self-evident of that the more they made this no different than any other product on the shelf of a beer, that their sales weren't growing, and that you needed distinction, you needed qualitative distinction. That was the only way you were going to get the kind of growth that they needed to be relevant, rather than acquisitions.
Oh, yeah, well, they couldn't innovate themselves, basically. Tastes in beer fragmented. The big beer companies, when they're sitting around in their boardrooms, they talk about occasions. And for every 10 occasions that someone would have to drink a beer, a generation or two ago, they would drink the same beer 8, 9, even 10 times. You're a Bud Light guy, you're a Miller guy, you're an old style guy, whatever it was. Along came craft beer, along came the American spirits industry, California wine. Starbucks got us thinking about coffee in a different way, and tastes fragmented wildly. And Anheuser-Busch could not, for those 10 occasions, people would drink 8, 9, 10 different beers for the 10 occasions, and that was
And then
trouble
some
for
people were drinking
Anheuser-Busch.
10 beers for just 5 occasions. In about a year from now, or a little less, Starbucks is opening up their their roaster. The largest one in the United States will be here.
Right.
It's the old.
That'll be an interesting experiment.
But what you said something about it will be. But if you look at them and you look at what Apple's doing, just take two kind of seminal, iconic companies in the United States that have gotten marketing and product down. They have decided to go towards the retail, the experience. The experience is almost as valuable, if not greater, than the product itself. And you're saying that the craft guys were on this way ahead of the geniuses.
When I read about that new Starbucks in the old Crate and Barrel space, the very first thing I thought of was this is taking a page out of the craft beer playbook. It works. That's what people want. That's what when people talk about.
I mean, that's what's happening at the Apple Store. It's really an experience before it is a purchase.
Yep. What do the millennials want? I mean, I've heard this over and over from beer people. They want experience. That is how people, especially the younger generation of consumer, and it's not just the millennials. I say that a little tongue in cheek.
No, I appreciated that for that moment right there, since I like craft beer.
It's us Gen Xers as well.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, no, that's what people want when they're buying any number of things, including a computer, coffee, beer, whatever it is. It's experience.
What caught your attention to write the Barrel Aged Stout? Why did you want to write about that moment? And what drew you as a writer to, when you were doing everything you're doing, just follow kind of, I mean, you and I first started talking about beer. Bars.
You've always been quite willing to jump on the phone and talk beer and bars.
Yeah.
I always appreciate that.
It's a lot different than strikes and deficits.
Yeah, it's probably a little less stressful.
It's how I deal with stress.
Let's talk about beer.
Yeah,
me too. Goose Island has long been one of the most interesting breweries in the country and the world. I was in Sweden with my brother 10 years ago and looked up on the wall of this beer bar and saw a bottle of Goose Island Bourbon County Stout there. And that was a light bulb moment for me. Wow, Goose Island has really made something. They are a literally world-class brewery. There they are on the wall of this bar in Sweden. When they sold to Anheuser-Busch in 2011, that was kind of a holy crap moment throughout the industry. The big bad bully of the beer industry is buying Chicago's Goose Island, the first time it's buying 100% of a craft brewery. What is going on here? And soon after the sale, I reached out to Goose Island's founder, John Hall, who was at Container Corporation for the first half of his career and was in his mid-40s and ready for his second act. And he started Goose Island in 1988, and then he sold it in 2011. And I called him. I said, I think there's more than another newspaper article here. I think there's a book-length narrative in the Goose Island story. The innovation, the struggles, the success. It served as sort of a metaphor for the rest of the industry. And then the sale was obviously, that was the turning point where it's like, okay, here's the conflict, that's going to sort of drive the whole narrative.
Did the entire rest of the microbrewery or craft beer industry turn their back on Goose Island and say you're a sellout? And
there was some of that.
Was that jealousy or principle?
Probably not a lot of jealousy initially. I'm sure there are plenty of brewery owners now who wish they had or wish they could sell for 40 million, 50 million, 100 million. I mean, the valuations are much higher than what they were when Goose Island sold. But it was a stunning moment for an industry that was, a lot of the ethos was independence. And Goose Island had, in a sense, quote unquote, betrayed the ethos. And so, there was some legitimate dismay directed in Goose Island's direction. But I think a lot of other people got it. I mean, John Hall was almost 70 years old at the time. He was ready. Goose Island was his second act. He was approaching 70. He was ready for his third act, and he was able to sell his company for nearly $40 million. And I'd say more people understood where he was coming from than didn't. But that said, it was a turning point of sorts for the craft beer industry.
What is your hope when somebody reads this, the one takeaway they have of the book?
That craft beer is a fascinating, dynamic industry that is far deeper than simply beer is fun. It's an industry that has grown from fewer than 100 breweries to more than 7,000, and it's complicated. It's full of colorful characters, and it just so happens that the product is really fun to consume and indulge in and smell and taste. It's much more interesting than the cracker industry or the refrigerator industry, but it's also very complex, and it's a pretty wild place with a lot of twists and turns.
If I was to ask you to take away the journalist hat and put on your sociology hat for a second, why do you think at this moment in time in America, the craft industry, unlike, I don't see it really happening in other developed countries, why do you think it's taking off at this point in urban America, and it's not just kind of...
Craft beer?
Yeah, the craft beer. Why do you think, what is it capturing that's a new business venture? It's not just guys in the garage doing something, but doing...
It started as that.
But it's matured.
Big time.
But what does it say about, here we are on Ravenswood West, down this corridor, 10 years ago there wasn't a single craft beer. Today there, if my count is right, close to 9. And also another big restaurant. We're at a place that has not just makes it, but also sells it and drinks it. What does it capture sociologically? What do you think's happening that made it that it's beyond the retail thing, that's got people making it and people wanting to consume it?
Yeah, that's a great question.
There's your second book.
I think... Well, actually, I did think about that for my second book.
Really?
Yeah, I did, yeah. A version of what you just... Well, I'm not doing it, though.
I still want 10% of it.
Okay. But I think it taps into something bigger, which is our tastes just developed and became more interesting, and we wanted variety, and we wanted fresh. I mean, it starts with, every restaurant is farm to table now, right? But 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that was an exciting thing, you know, and it was new. We eat better, we drink better. I mean, in some ways, we're still a nation of McDonald's, and Bud Light's still the biggest selling beer in the country. I mean, that hasn't changed. But, there's been a cultural shift, and beer just happens to be the thing that is of the every man and every woman, right? I mean, we love and embrace beer in a way different than we do wine or spirits.
It's an there's a piece of anti-establishment.
Oh,
in
absolutely.
This. Yeah.
And so, as we said at the beginning, beer tasted homogenized.
Right.
Everything tastes the same. Everything had no flavor. And the establishment was responsible for that. And craft beer was the alternative. It was flavor. I mean, you smell these beers in front of us here.
What do you got there?
We got a couple IPAs. We have...
That's my favorite.
Haphazardly, I think that's the flagship IPA here at Begyle. 7%.
So what goes into an IPA?
Hops, and more hops, which they smell it. Oh, it smells gorgeous. You're going to get a lot of fruitiness out of that, some bitterness, and it's just...
And you can tell the difference between... Do you like IPA?
I love IPA, yeah.
Yeah.
I like most styles if they're done well, to be honest.
Okay. When did double IPA start hitting up?
I actually published a little story today about a great double IPA made in Minnesota. So we won't talk about that, but it's still a great double.
But why is that an American phenomenon, double IPA?
Oh, yeah. And actually, so globally, we are seeing an incredible expansion in craft beer.
Oh.
And initially, American brewers, when craft beer started, were mimicking English brewing, Belgian brewing, German brewing. Now the world is mimicking American brewing. Because these kinds of I think you just took a sip of the oatmeal IPA.
Oatmeal, that is perfect. It's a breakfast food.
There you go. There is a breakfast stout, and it includes oatmeal.
I may start drinking that right before City Council. That is really good,
right? I mean, so this is just a world away from when Budweiser.
Do you think we can call in
show.
Chinese food, and this would be perfect?
Or some pizza?
Yeah. So. In the book, you say 1988 is to the craft brew industry what 67 was to rock and roll.
Right. I think it was.
You said, wait,
I haven't read the book in a while, to be honest. I think it was 69, not 67.
You said 1988, 69. You're correct. U.S. history for 200. It was Abbey Road, Let It Be, and the Velvet Underground.
And Led Zeppelin 1 and Led Zeppelin 2, which is pretty impressive. So 69 was a watershed moment in rock and roll. You know, it was the year rock and roll was sort of let's say, cemented in the mainstream. It was a legendary year where legendary things happened. 1988 was that for craft beer in the United States. Goose Island opened. Deschutes in Bend, Oregon opened. A pub owned by Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper opened. North Coast in California opened. There were.
When did Sierra Nevada?
They opened in '79. So Sierra they're the godfather of the whole thing. They would be Buddy Holly, I guess, if we're going to beat this rock and roll metaphor into the ground. '88 was sort of the turning point moment, I think, where craft beer was really established as, and it was still very, very small at the time. There were fewer than 200 breweries in the country. But '88 was the turning point. What's happening in 2018, that's tough to answer because it's getting really tough out there. There are now more than 7,000 breweries, and more breweries closed last year than have ever closed in any previous year. Then again, more breweries opened last year than have ever opened in a previous year. And 2018 is on pace for even more closures than last year was, and probably more openings too. So
is that for cost reasons or just saturation, you think?
Well, that's sort of the question. That's why it's hard to answer exactly what's happening in 2018.
Do you think that the microbrewery craft beers that go from kind of making the beer, putting in the barrel, etc., now the tap room, like where we are, that becomes another kind of way of distribution and also a slight different kind of...
Yep, I think actually the tap room is what is allowing beer to continue to grow. That's why the nation can be home to 7,000 breweries, and honestly, it can probably be home to another, 3,000, 5,000 in the right location with the right funding and good beer and the right product. But yeah, tap rooms have been a game changer and have allowed breweries to thrive. That said, it is really tight on shelves right now. If you're opening a new brewery and you're going to try to get on beer store shelves and get on taps and the hot bars, good luck to you. It's tough out there.
It's already brutal.
Yeah. That said, I don't think I'm always hesitant to use the word saturation just because I think, again, a good product with the right branding, there's probably always going to be room for that. It's just the bar's getting higher and higher.
It is. There's a whole art around the design of the cans in the way that fine wine has a whole design around the label. Is there a whole separate industry for that?
That's a great point. And that was part of what set craft beer apart. I mean, Budweiser has that iconic look. Everyone knows what a can of Budweiser looks like. But then here comes Three Floyds over the border there in Munster, Indiana, putting demons with swords and fire on their beer labels, and they looks like a comic book, and that strikes a chord with people. It's fun, it's different, it's irreverent, and people.
It's all part of that same culture.
It's part of the same culture, and it really sort of reflects what's in the bottle as well. It's bold art, and it's a bold product inside the bottle.
Okay, what do we have in front of us here? What's this?
That's a big bad boy right there. That is an oatmeal stout aged in bourbon barrels. It is called...
Is it different, the barrels?
Imperial Pajamas.
Meaning that a bourbon barrel...
And there's another thing. The names are fun, too. Imperial Pajamas. I mean, it's just...
I'm not drinking this until it's called Imperial Feety Pajamas.
This has the ABV of wine, by the way.
We also got 13.5%.
Yep.
That's big, right?
That's grande, yes. And so the title of the book is Barrel Aged Stout and Selling Out. And so this is a barrel aged stout. And the very first brewery to do this, to put an imperial stout in bourbon barrels and let it age to get the character of the barrels, the oak and the bourbon, and then the sort of secondary flavors that come through, like vanilla and things like that, chocolate. Goose Island was the first in the country to do that. That started here in Chicago. And now any ambitious brewery, more or less, is going to make a barrel-aged stout.
Hold on. What am I tasting for? I don't want to drink this until I'm told.
Well, see, I would say you should drink it and you should tell me what you taste. I don't want to tell you what to taste. Everyone's got their own palate.
All right. It's thicker.
Thicker, absolutely.
It's got a stronger kind of hit from get-go.
Yep.
I'm Jewish and I want to go to bed now. And it's also got more...
But for the record, I'm Jewish and I could drink four of these.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk to you about what root... You must be Reform. This is also much more... licorice. It has more of a...
I would say that I think black licorice, I think there are undertones of that. I think that's fair, absolutely.
So what would be... You got
But you get a lot of oak and a lot of bourbon out of this, right? I mean, it's boozy, right?
Yeah, that's actually... I was going to say that. That was my second way of saying it.
A lot of these beers have sort of a chocolate and vanilla dynamic. Some will skew more chocolate, some will skew more vanilla. The best ones have both. I think this one has both. I think this is a really nice
bourbon barrels
example of it.
What other type of barrels are there?
Rye whiskey barrels. I mean, the red wine barrels, white wine barrels. Red wine's pretty popular, but generally not for
And what does
some
that give
stouts,
off?
but
What does a red wine barrel give off?
Again,
More fruity?
What you would expect from red wine, sort of those kinds of tannins, like you're going to get that in the beer. A red wine barrel-aged stout is actually a really lovely thing. You don't see them very often. This is sort of the bedrock right here.
Say, here's in Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
here are the 5 craft brewers you should keep your eye on. Nobody knows them today, but you're going to know more about them in the next year.
So don't name...
Don't say good question, and you can't even go.
No, that's an okay question on it, if we're going to be honest.
It's a B minus, gentleman B.
I used to get gentleman C's when I was in college.
Yeah.
So you're saying not the bigger breweries that everyone already knows about, like Half Acre or Revolution?
Right. But if you took Half Acre and Revolution and some of the kind of...
Or Metropolitan?
Yeah.
Boy, that's tough. That's kind of putting me on the spot.
Well, okay, you walk in.
There's a lot of good beer being made in Chicago.
Where
right
are
now.
we?
We're at Begyle.
Okay,
and
this is one.
Very good beer.
They're
Yes.
very good. We love their IPA.
I love Dovetail, which is a block away.
Okay.
They're doing, and that's one of the fun things about beer is that here are 2
Have
breweries.
I mentioned that we're at Beguile's yet?
We are at Begyle.
Okay,
Yes.
we're upstairs with the barrel.
Drinking the beer, and the beer's
good.
tasty.
Yeah.
So we have.
That gives me a discount that I can take after I'm a mayor.
I think you. I think
I've
you'll
earned
be
my
okay.
discount.
Yeah.
There it is.
2 breweries in Chicago, 1 block away,
Yeah.
doing completely different things. You're going to go to Begyle, you're going to have one experience. You're going to go to Dovetail and drink one, sort of approach to
signature,
beer.
yeah.
And then you're going to go to Dovetail and you're going to have a completely different experience, enjoy a completely different approach to beer. And that's another reason I think that craft beer has been able to do so well nationally and in Chicago is that there's a lot to represent.
You have a place you go and you like to drink?
My basement is loaded with beer.
Okay, besides that.
Besides my basement?
Because you and I used to talk about it. I have the list of our original bars that I got a new one for you.
Oh, what is it? Tell me.
California Clipper. It was new for me. It may not be new for you.
Yeah, no, California Clipper's hot with the cool kids, so I guess you're one of the cool kids now. I like Bad Apple up here. That was actually where I sort of cut and you've mentioned that one before, but I used to live 40-second walk from Bad Apple, and Bad Apple was one of the places where I cut my teeth as a beer drinker. And beer writer. I was such a regular there. I'd walk in and the bartender, this guy Adam, I don't know if he's still there. I hope he is. Adam would just start pouring me samples. This is what we have that's new. Try this, try this, try this,
Do you
try
go
this.
by ambiance of the bar, or do you go by the bartender that you get comfortable?
I'm a little less
convenience?
of an ambiance guy than, or even a service guy. I always feel like if you have great food and great beer or great wine, whatever it is, the thing that I'm after, then I can forgive a lot.
Why do you think Chicago, while late, has made such a big presence in the craft brewery? We've made a lot of real estate up.
Oh, huge!
Why?
20 years ago, we basically had a few breweries, and now we have the 5th most breweries of any city in the country.
Yeah, it's not attributed to the mayor, so what do you think it is? But that could be one guess if you wanted to go with that.
Well, you can go with that.
Yeah, that's what I tell myself every night before I go to bed.
We're a big city. Again, I'm going to go with the disposable income and youth and
changing demographics.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. The changing demographics. Yeah.
But it's not isolated. One thing I learned in our city's Friday night flights, where we've kind of sponsored this. It is happening in all corners.
I talked to a brewery owner today who is planning to announce in the coming weeks that he is going to open a tap room on the far, far, far northwest side, like out by O'Hare, like at the last stop before you hit the suburbs. And he said part of the appeal was that there's no other brewery out there. So yeah, it has gone far and wide.
But see, this is going past kind of the core consumer. It's the kind of millennial kind of...
the core consumer is definitely... morphed and changed and grown, and it's I think they're in a sense craft beer probably can grow in a lot of directions that it hasn't. As much as it has grown, it can probably still grow far more by appealing to someone who's like, I'm a Bud Light guy. Oh yeah, well, try this cream ale from Begyle, and he might say, oh wow, I prefer that actually.
In 1979, your book notes that the tax law changed. And that allowed something to happen. And then you say in 88, which is less than a decade, is like one of the most significant years. What happened in that tax law that kind of put a key in the ignition?
What people say a lot is Jimmy Carter deregulated beer, which is not quite true. There was an amendment sponsored by, I want to say it was Alan Cranston, Democrat of California. And it legalized homebrewing. It's mind-blowing to me that before 1979, homebrewing wasn't legal in the U.S. But it wasn't, and Prohibition screwed up this country in so many ways, and that was... So homebrewing became legal, and it just allowed people to experiment in their garages. And it took off from there. So yeah, homebrewing becoming legal was the turning point, and Sierra Nevada opened less than a year later. And then within a decade, it was starting to, the seeds were being planted. A brewery in Chicago, a brewery in Cleveland, a brewery in Philadelphia, et cetera.
If you were telling somebody, would you advise them to get into the craft brewery business?
No.
Okay.
Well, there's a lot of competition out there. I think for the right person, yeah, it'd probably be really fun and a pretty neat adventure and a pretty cool form of self-expression to open a brewery. But yeah, you gotta be well financed. You need to be making really good beer and have a good product. And I think you would also need to have very realistic goals of what you're trying to achieve. If your goal is to sell to Anheuser-Busch for $75 million, well, that probably isn't going to happen. If it's to even get distribution on shelves at Jewel at this point, that's going to be a challenge.
I don't see how that happens.
It's tough, and so if you're going to do that, you got to have a tap room, and you have to be in a good location.
Does any other newspaper do what the Tribune does, in the sense I have somebody that's dedicated to your space?
I am the luckiest SOB in newspapers. I was a news writer. I wrote crime for a long time. And then
you don't have like a colleague at San Francisco Examiner.
Well, there's someone who there are people who write about beer at other newspapers, but there's no one who's basically a full-time beer writer.
It is kind of cool that the Tribune dedicated that.
It just sort of happened. I was the travel writer, and I started writing about beer. Slowly, beer became more of my job. Travel became less of my job, and now I'm full-time beer with a little bit of food here and there. But I was just the right guy at the right place, right time, and I was lucky that people like Kevin of Begyle were opening breweries and gave me something to write about. And this industry that did not exist in Chicago basically 20 years ago suddenly was existing with full force, and there was something to write about all the time, and people were interested in it. My stories are some of the best read stories in the Tribune food and dining section, which is
telling.
Still, yeah, it's hugely telling, and it's still incredible. And it's not, I'd love to take all the credit, but the truth is they're interested in what's happening in Chicago beer.
I also think, we're down the road, and I got for Koval, and I think whiskey's also going to be that kind of distillery. It's going to be, I don't think it's going to be what microbrewery is, but it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's started for sure. And I think Koval probably opened, they've probably been open close to 10 years now.
But they're like, it's a whole different space, but I know what's going on in the sense of the approach that she's had from major players in the same way that Goose Island did. She's now all over the world and being exported. It's just amazing what's happening.
They make great stuff.
Yeah.
But, a $50 bottle of whiskey will never be a $4 pint of beer, So in that sense, I don't think craft spirits will ever come close to what craft beer is doing. But it has been most definitely part of the revolution in terms of how we think about food and, what we eat and drink and how we shop differently.
Josh, thank you.
Thank
We're here
you.
at Chicago Stories. We got to do a quick wrap. Ready?
Let's do it.
You got it. Okay. Cups or socks?
Cups.
Thick or thin pizza?
That's
just
if I had to choose, I guess I'm going thin.
Sears or Hancock?
Hancock.
Lake or river?
Lake.
16-inch or 12-inch softball?
12.
That's 3 out of 5. You got it. Yeah, you win. Pass. All right, man. Chicago Stories with Josh Noel, and here for barrel-aged stout and selling out if you want to know about the craft brewery industry across the country and specifically Chicago. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's fun.
Great. Good questions by the mayor.
Not bad.
You've been listening to Chicago Stories with Mayor Rahm Emanuel. You can subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tweet your guest ideas using hashtag ShyStories. Thanks for listening.